weird. This is household cash balances, money sitting in checking and savings accounts. Prior to the pandemic, all American households together had about $1 trillion. Today, all American households today have about $4.6 trillion. Cash, just sitting there. And again, it's not just the ultra-rich. If you look across different levels of income, the bottom 50%, their holdings are up almost 200%. The next 50 to 90th, up 250%. The top 99th percentile, up 300%. There's so much cash. And this cash doesn't care about the federal funds rate. This cash doesn't care about inflation. This cash will continue to keep consumers going. And what's intriguing is despite all this, again, our government is viewing inflation as a problem. So we had the Inflation Reduction Act, which I love the irony in that particular title. Because what it does, by the way, is it expands the federal deficit over the next couple of years from $1 trillion to over $1 trillion. In other words, it's stimulative. Ergo, it will actually serve to increase inflation at some modest level. And oh, by the way, have you gotten your gas rebate yet? Anyone? We have a problem with households having too much money, and Gavin is running around giving us checks. What is wrong with us? Really, what is wrong with us? Now, of course, the banking climate is tightening up because of the flat yield curve, but even here, it doesn't look too dramatic. For consumer loans, they're just kind of back to normal. Mortgage loans, they're getting a little shy. They're really shy in commercial real estate loans. That sector right now is cooling off big time, commercial real estate, but it's a relatively small part of the economy, so probably not all that important. And a little bit in C&I loans as well. I'm not quite sure why, because when you think about businesses, again, businesses are fine too. Profits will continue to grow in the second quarter of the year. We haven't gotten third quarter numbers yet, but I anticipate they'll be decent. Overall corporate debt to equity ratios are relatively low. Debt payments for companies is still relatively low. It's not that big of a deal for them either. Business investment, new orders for IT equipment keep going up. Science, research, and development job postings on Indeed are still way higher than they were pre-pandemic. Again, this doesn't seem to me to be a business sector that's suffering because of Fed policy. And biggest problem with businesses right now is they can't find workers. Now, the job openings rate's still 6%, which is lower than the peak it was a year ago, 7%, but still well above where it was pre-pandemic. And you look across the right-hand side, healthcare, leisure, hospitality, professional, logistics, other services, financial activities, everything has elevated levels of job openings. What happened? Well, this was always going to happen. Demographics. I've talked about this for years. But everybody gets bored of long-run forecasts. That's when you're looking at your phone and checking your tax and all that kind of stuff. But we knew this was going to happen. The basic demographics. Boomers all came out of families of 12 kids, all had one kid. Now that boomers are retiring, we're only bringing one worker into the workforce. One Gen Z. Complaining. Moaning. Doing nasty TikTok videos and posting them about his boss doesn't understand his feelings and doesn't know how to dress right. Anyway, we get it. But the key here, what made this so immediate was, again, the great retirement. 2020, 3 million people dropped out of the workforce. The vast majority of them dropped out because they said, we retired. I'm stuck at home anyway. I got tons of money in my bank account, and I just refied my home at 2.5%. I'm out of here. Sayonara. And so it became very, very immediate. It's not going to change. The census forecast for growth of people in their prime working years is basically zero for the next 20 years. It's just not going to grow unless they fix immigration. Good luck with that. You think that they can get that possibly accomplished in D.C.? It's tragic. And of course, on the right-hand side, there is an upside to this, by the way. It's good for income inequality. Starting about 2016, because of labor shortages, earnings growth for low-skilled folks, lower-paid folks, started growing faster than everybody else. And by the way, that took off over the last couple of years People in the bottom 50% of earnings have seen the fastest pace of earnings growth over the last couple of years. A couple of things to remark on that. First of all, again, if you're worried about income inequality, your market solution has arrived. This has been going on since 2016. For 6 years, income inequality has been falling in the United States. Has anybody seen that story in the New York Times? Has anybody heard this discussed in Sacramento? Again, you don't tell me this good news. I'm miserablist. I'm miserablist? How does that work? I'm not sure how to say that. Anyway, but you can see my point. Now, another thing here to keep in mind is, yet again, where does that money go? Well, earnings growth for the bottom, look, if you give, I'm going to say it, if you give Bezos $100 million, he doesn't care. He doesn't even notice. He doesn't even roll over in bed. Who cares? But those earnings increase in the bottom 50% almost immediately turn into demand. Yet again, even more support for consumer spending as our economy moves forward. One last thing is, while this is great news from a socio-demographic standpoint, this is a real problem if you happen to be a restaurant or a hotel or any other company that relies on low-skilled labor to make things happen on a day-to-day basis. The cost of doing business is going through the roof, and it's not going to change. Again, labor shortages are everywhere. Yet again, we're devolving into this game. Who's ahead? Who's behind? Who's strong? Who's weak? California is tragic. It's terrible. We haven't added all our jobs back. We haven't quite recovered. Stop. Every part of this nation, red or blue, old or young, silent generation or Gen Z, I don't care who you are, where you are, in this country, the one thing we have in common is help wanted signs. This is everywhere. And Texas has more jobs now than California, and than they did pre-pandemic, where California has fewer. California's unemployment rate is now at the lowest it has ever been. Texas isn't quite back to where they were pre-pandemic. So again, it's a function of labor scarcity, no more, no less. And if you look around, Tanner brought this up, I don't need to reiterate, the places that have seen growth in California are places that have seen labor force growth, namely the inland parts of the state. Inland Empire, Stockton, Sacramento, Fresno, Bakersfield. What do these places have in common? They have all seen labor force growth over the last few years. They've seen labor force growth either because people are moving away from the coast, the crowded coast, to getting to a little more elbow space, because fewer people out there retired, because they have more and affordable housing, which means they have a younger population. I can go on and on for all the reasons, but that is why you're seeing job growth in those areas. And labor force solutions are a centerpiece of all economic development efforts. Yeah, we continue. I just saw an article the other day in the paper talking about how a lot of development organizations were really yet again going back to giving companies money to bring your jobs here. Again, can we drop that? It's not jobs, jobs, jobs anymore. It's workers, workers, workers. You have the workers, the employers will come. Employers understand labor shortages. You look at guys who have a little bit of footloose investment. I mean, like, if you want to run a restaurant, you got to be local. But if you're going to do a warehouse, you have some options. And they are going away from places like the Inland Empire, which has been an enormous source of new industrial development, but there's nobody left. The unemployment rate in the Inland Empire is just above 3%. There's nobody to hire. So now they're taking their industrial and they're going to the Central Valley. They're going to the high desert. You have to, because there's nobody to hire in some of those core areas anymore. So employers will chase the workers. You need to bring the workers. How do you do that? It's real simple in California. It's the one place where you can say, build it and they will come. You build housing, your economy will expand. Can I say one thing as well? It's not single family, folks. It's multifamily. Multifamily, multifamily, multifamily. You have lots of single family. You need multifamily. That's entry-level workers. That's low-skilled workers. That's young families. That's recent college graduates. These folks need apartments. They're not going to buy a home when you're 27. You shouldn't. But if you want those people here to start businesses and continue to be part of this community and eventually buy one of those homes, you have to start with apartments. We don't build multifamily in smaller economies in California. We don't. It's very simple. Now, you've seen, of course, a big earnings jump across the board because of this stuff. And even in the face of earnings jumps, again, our government, we just passed AB 257. It's being threatened right now. Are you familiar with AB 257? It's our new minimum wage law. But it's not really minimum wage because the minimum wage applies to everything. Now what they're doing, they're going after specific industries. In this case, it's corporate fast food. Corporate fast food, you are now going to be subject to the whims of a governor-appointed wage board who operates completely outside of the normal legislative system. And they can raise wages at fast food restaurants up to $22 an hour. Now, right off the bat, we're solving a problem that doesn't exist anymore. Okay? Because earnings in fast food restaurants are already going through the roof because of labor shortages. B, why are we going around the legislative process? You don't just hand off wage setting policies to random boards. It's not how you run an economy. It's a crazy degree of regulatory overreach. And while this may not mean much unless you're a McDonald's franchisee, in which case this could be a death knell for you, but on the other hand, where are we going with this? Is this really what we want to spend time on? The California story over and over again is housing. We don't build enough. Simple as that. Texas has built a third of all housing in Texas has been built since 2000. California, 15%. Look at California, Texas permits compared to California right now. Who's building, who's not? So again, what are you going to do here? So that brings me, of course, to a conversation about, well, real estate. Where's real estate going? No doubt, very cold. Sales are down. Home prices are starting to fall. New home housing starts, particularly single family, are down. Months' supply of new homes for sale are reaching a truly scary level. Almost 10 months. Only time it's been higher than that was in the middle of the Great Recession. But this isn't the Great Recession. I mean, what you have here, of course, is a function of sticker shock. How could you not? Take the median price of a new home, just keeping that constant. Before everything started going crazy here, if you bought a new home with 100% loan to value, you don't do that, but you get it, it would cost you about $15,000 a year when interest rates were below 3%. They go up above 7%, now it's $27,000 a year. It almost doubled. Of course, everybody's going, whoa, my annual cost just got really high. It's a sticker shock problem. But at the same time, while sticker shock in the housing market is going down, we have the bizarre phenomenon where consumer demand, including consumer demand for housing, is still strong. The housing market's sagging. Look at rental prices. They're going through the roof. Vacancy rates are falling. So demand for housing is strong. It's the asset price that's the problem. Those don't usually work together. You think this market's going to collapse? No way. $30 trillion. That's how much equity is in U.S. real estate right now. $30 trillion. Context is important. A decade ago, it was $10 trillion. We have the lowest debt-to-equity ratio in U.S. housing ever. Housing costs as a share of income are close to the lowest they've ever been. As for vacancies, take a look at overall housing vacancy rates. I got for sale, for rent, and then overall vacant year-round, which includes like second homes and everything else. If you look at 2012, 2008, 3.6, 3.5% in the West for sale, for rent, 2% now. Overall vacancies in 2012, 9%, this time 6.6%. There's nothing. There's no vacancy, tons of equity, debt markets are clean, there's increasing demand for housing. Yeah, outside of the interest rate, housing is still incredibly strong. So forget the foreclosure phenomenon. Home prices are going to fall some, but only a modest amount. And ultimately, this is going to be a market that's going to be characterized by a low level of liquidity. The big problem for new home buyers is they tend to build up here. And then people sell this home and they buy this one. And they sell this home and they buy the new one. And everybody's doing this game, move-up game, right? Move up, move up, move up. Well, this move-up just ended. Because this person's like, yeah, let me see. I just locked in on a 30-year fixed rate, 2.75% mortgage. I don't think I'm going to sell. So what's interesting about that is we know there's demand for housing, but the move-up market that typically supports the new home market is going to completely freeze. Builders still have an opportunity, but you've got to build what people can get into down here. It's called building townhouses, condos, apartment buildings. Yeah, and back to rental. So there's opportunities, but it's a different kind of opportunity. As for our housing market, median prices are starting to come down. But again, don't complain to me about this, all right? Median home price in California went from $600,000 to almost 900,000 in 2 years. 50%? That's insanity. Of course it has to come down some, but it's never going to be back to where it was in 2019. Sales are way down right now. But again, month supply of sale, incredibly tight. California housing vacancy, never been lower. California rental markets, vacancy rates are down, income and rents asking rents are up. You can see some recent dynamics. Yes, active listings, this is Southern California. Active listings are coming up pretty sharply, but they're still way below where they were in 2019. So it isn't the wipeout you hear about. What worries me more than anything else is how our government is viewing rental increases. Because it's clear the tone in Sacramento is tipping towards rent control. Yet again. Why? Our rents are up a lot. But why do you think rents are up? That's a good question. Why do you think rents are up? Do you think they just go up by themselves? You think there's like some smoke-filled room in a basement somewhere and the 9 or 10 people who own every multifamily unit in the state are like, ha, we'll really get them now. Ha ha, raise it, yeah. When you have falling vacancy rates and rents are going up, it's a demand phenomenon. Just like the high cost of gasoline is a demand phenomenon. What's interesting here, look at the share of households paying over 35% housing cost to income. We had an enormous increase in rents, an enormous increase in home prices from 2018 to 2021, and there's been no increase in housing cost-constrained households. This is going one for one with household incomes. So no, rent control would be a really bad idea right now. But again, don't let reality intrude on their nice narrative. By the way, when we're talking about housing, we've got to talk a little bit about water, because a lot of the resistance to building housing in California has to do with the fact we don't have enough water. Now, San Luis Obispo is a little different. You guys have your own water system. But I want to talk about the rest of the state for just a second, because it's worth noting that, yes, we have a drought. But I want to note that 80% of the water in the state goes to ag, which is 2% of the state's economy. All right? And more importantly, it's how it's allocated to ag that really bothers me, okay? Because how it's given to ag is in use it or lose it water rights. Here's your water. You may use it to grow stuff. If you don't use it, I will take it away from you. What are we doing? Now, by the way, I don't have a problem with grapes. I don't have a problem with almonds. These are high-value crops. These are worth growing. What I have a problem with is hay. And to be clear, hay is a reasonable crop. It feeds livestock. It has value to it. And really, because water is scarce, you see less and less hay being grown. Hay alfalfa production, you can see it's actually dropped. Over the last 15 years, hay production in California has almost halved. That's a good thing. This is a very low-value crop, very water-intensive. 5 acre-feet per acre per year. Look at exports of hay. Right now, over half the hay we grow in our state is being put on boats and shipped out of this country. We are exporting hay in a drought. What are we doing? And to be clear, I'm not saying take it away from the hay farmers. Not at all. I would make a much different deal. I would pass a law in this state that says, look, you no longer have use it or use it rights. You may sell your water if you choose to. That would completely change everything. Not just from urban to ag uses, but even within the ag sector. Because ag farmers who are doing the high-value crops can get the water they need, and those who are doing the low-value crop will make a hell of a lot more money selling their water than they ever will selling hay. It's win-win-win, people. The only thing to lose is the Saudi Arabian cows. Couldn't care less. Non-res has got its problems as well, but again, it's the underlying demand. Warehousing is still tight. Retail is shockingly steady. Only office is seeing some problems, but Tanner said it exactly right. When it comes to office space, what most employers are realizing, their employees aren't going to come to the office 2 to 3 days a week, but they still need a desk. They still want their picture of their dog hung up. They still need a place to put their files. And as long as they're being productive, you're going to keep that office space for them. So this idea that everybody's going to work, 10,000 miles away from the office, probably not true, as the case may be. There will be some changes here, primarily in the commodity space, but it's not the end of the world. Ultimately, the biggest problem we have in our economy is federal debt. In the last 2 years, $6.5 trillion in borrowing. Let me put this in context. That's $20,000 for every single person in this nation. $20,000. This table right here, $120,000 in debt. You guys have your checkbook for me? Yeah? Over here. That's 160 over here. In the last 20 years, $60,000 in federal debt. What are we doing? When does this end? We have a 120% debt to GDP ratio. We have a over $1 trillion structural deficit right now. Now, how long can this go? We have a period of time where boomers are retiring. There's going to be big increases in defined spending on Medicare and Social Security, right? These benefits are built in. We don't have any legal options on this. So we know this is not sustainable. And where this gets weird is when you realize that the big problem with the Federal Reserve policy is how it's causing the cost of federal government debt to go up. Right now, overall federal interest payments as a percent of GDP are a little over 2%. But as they both continue to borrow over $1 trillion a year and have to refi all the existing debt, of the $30 trillion in existing federal debt, the half-life is about 5 years. Over the next 5 years, they're going to have to refi $15 trillion at significantly higher interest rates. You're going to watch that interest payment as a percent of GDP go up. And by the way, that's going to make the deficit even larger, and so on and so forth. When does that break? When do bond markets say enough is enough? My honest answer is no idea. You thought I had an idea, did you? No. No one can know that one. That's way over the top. You can't figure that one out. What I do know is the dollar is very strong right now. And that tells me if bond markets are worried, they're not very worried. Or at least they're less worried about us than everybody else, right? So I'm not so worried about this, but we know we have this issue. What's more immediate, of course, is the state. Because last year, remember how they were celebrating that $100 billion surplus? And I think last year I told you it wasn't a surplus. Remember that conversation? It was instead we were just grabbing all those capital gains returns and bringing them forward, and we ought to hang on to it. Well, guess what? We're already down 16% in our budget this year. And again, no one's going to talk about it till the election's over. But in December, and particularly in January when they're doing the budget, watch for chaos in Sacramento, because we will probably be seeing $15 billion deficits this year, probably $30 billion next year. So the already hitting road locally, this is the problem we're facing with the government revenues, rather, if you will, than local wages. So if I had to sum everything up, the expansion is going to continue. Wealth and income will drive consumer spending. Construction is going to go into a deep freeze unless you can find those places in the market where you could build to meet demand. Inflation will continue to run hot, but the economy is ultimately brittle. As already noted, real estate is going to be chilly but hot. Asset values are going to fall some. Lender profits are going to get squeezed, but the underlying asset quality to remain strong, and rents will continue to rise for most types of real estate. As for where we go from here, well, if everybody just stopped, we'd be okay. My worry is the Federal Reserve. They just raised 3/4 of a bip, and they say they're going to keep doing it. Until when? You are trying to cure inflation by crushing, you're attempting to cure consumer-driven inflation by crushing real estate. That doesn't work. Now, eventually, you can crush the economy. Listen, you get the federal funds rate up to 12%, I guarantee we're going to have a recession. Will they go that far? I hope not. Could they? I don't know what they're going to do. They don't seem to have a basic grasp of their job. Wild cards, a long-run fiscal situation in the U.S. dollar, I'm not sure where that's going. China is swooning. That's an interesting thing we haven't even talked about here. But again, ultimately, the problem remains the narrative. We have policymakers who are running around solving problems that don't exist. And in doing so, they're making problems that are going to have real impacts on our lives. And, it's easy to pick on elected leaders, right? Oh, you politicians, and how many jokes. There's more jokes about politicians than there are about economists. Says something. But let's remember what a politician is at some level. They're trying to get elected to become, if you will, a leader. The idea of becoming elected is really the idea of figuring out what the narrative is and tapping into it and running with it. What are people talking about, and how do I talk about it in such a way that I can go to Sacramento, go to DC, and, if you will, serve their interests? There are representatives, people. And if they're doing things that don't make sense, it's because of our narratives. It's not them. They're a reflection of us. So when you're sitting around that Thanksgiving table and you're having these conversations with Ethan, remember that. Remember that everybody needs to just calm down, recognize that all this chaos and strife in our country is completely self-created. Never have Americans been as prosperous and happy and as healthy at a person-to-person level as we are right now. But our inability or unwillingness to recognize that is creating strife that can create true tragedy if we don't straighten up and start getting on the right path again. Thank you very much, everybody. It's great again.
Wow, always a fun time. I don't know about you. I'm looking forward to the Q&A with Chris and Tanner. I did get a little nervous when he started talking about taking water from farmers. I got a little nervous, but he backed that one out very nicely. Good job, Chris. All right, folks. Well, in just a minute, we are going to play our favorite Central Coast Economic Forecast game, red card, green card. Okay, you heard about Chris's opinions. Now we're going to hear about your opinions. But first, I want to invite another video from one of our valued sponsors, the Dana Reserve.
Hi, I'm Nick Tompkins, the managing partner of the Dana Reserve Housing Development in Nipomo. Thank you to Chris Thornberg and the Central Coast Economic Forecast for an informative and enlightening morning. As you may have heard today, the state housing shortage has reached a crisis level, especially on the Central Coast. That is why we are honored to propose a project that is filled with housing options to address the issue of the missing middle and allow our workforce to also live locally. With amenities such as parks, restaurants, groceries, high-speed fiber internet, a child care center, a Cuesta South satellite campus, a People's Self-Help Inclusionary Housing Project, the Dana Reserve will help Nipomo and future residents to thrive and prosper. Thank you again for joining us today, and now back to the program.
All right, folks, you know how to play the game. Look on your table. You've got a red card and a green card. We're about to conduct our highly scientific study of the Central Coast business leaders here. I'm going to pose a few questions. You're going to raise the card that reflects your perspective on my questions. So we'll warm up with an easy one. Green card, if gas is going to cost less next year. Red card if it costs more. I heard this morning we're down to $5.35 in Morro Bay. Okay, I'm going to give that one to the Greens. A bunch of optimists in the room that gas is in fact coming down. All right, how about interest rates? We all heard Federal Reserve raising rates, potentially a problem for housing. Green, if rates are going to be lower than they are today. I think the 30-year mortgage was up around 7%. So green if they're going to be lower, red if you think they're going to be the same or higher. Oh, wow. I take back my comment about optimists in the room. That's disappointing to the home buyers. I'm so sorry. I'm curious to hear about employment growth. So it's easy to look at these statistics and these big macro trends, but I want to know what you guys are feeling about employment growth within your businesses, because a lot of us are feeling that demand to hire more people, right? So green, if you think your business is going to have more or a higher employee headcount this time next year. Red, if you think you'll be the same or contract a little bit. Interesting. There's pockets of red. I would love to drill down a little bit more, but I'm going to give that one to the Greens. I think everyone's thinking we're still going to grow our way out of this. All right. Again, this is so self-serving. These are all just the things I'm wondering about. We're going to get a little political here, but I do, we've got a measure on the ballot to fund some remodels of our local elementary schools. I'm kind of curious. Green if you think Measure C is going to pass. Red if you think it will fail. All right. A lot of greens in the room. My children, thank you. All right, let's see. Where do we want to take this? Let's look at remote work. All right. Let's go with green if you think your business will have more remote workers next year, and red if you think it will have fewer or the same. Oh, that's really interesting. So preponderance of red. Looks like many of you are bringing folks back to the office. Fascinating. All right, one last one. This one actually comes from Bob Wacker. He had to get me to plug it in. Green if you think the Astros are going to win the World Series. Red if you think the Phillies will win. So green Astros, red Phillies. Beautiful. When is the Super Bowl anyway? I don't even... All right, folks. Well, thank you so much. That's fascinating data. Not a scientific study, but I love it anyway. You also shared your opinion today over text about our 5 entrepreneurs, and now it's time to bring Judy back up to the stage to present the results.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for voting this morning. And so the winner is Adam with TRIC Robotics.
Woo!
Thank you so much, everyone. This is it's been an amazing opportunity to share what we're doing with this important crowd. You know, I think it's amazing that we have so much support in the Central Coast, and we're super excited to grow our business here, and hopefully we can make a huge impact on the way we farm and feed the people. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Great job, Adam. Congratulations. I have no doubt all 5 of our companies today are going to be successful. That sure was an inspiring time to hear from them. All right. So let's see. I think we have another sponsor video before. Yes, indeed. One more sponsor video, and we are going to dive into your questions. If you haven't sent one in yet, I've been reviewing them. We've got some good ones. It's not too late. So go ahead and fire in your questions, and let's hear from KSBY.
Good morning. I'm Nina Lozano.
And I'm Richard Gearhart with KSBY News. We hope you're enjoying this morning's program. As KSBY approaches its 70th anniversary this coming year, we want to take a moment and say thank you for putting your trust in us year after year.
We're proud to be your preferred choice for local news and information, providing you with in-depth coverage on the stories that matter to all of us living right here on the coast. This last year, we've shared so many inspiring stories of people doing good, who stepped up when the going got tough. You can expect to see more good news highlighted in our newscasts with our special series, Positively Central Coast.
And we'll continue to cover the impacts of the economy and what it takes to make it living here in our Price of Paradise reports. From the high cost of housing to the challenges of owning and operating a business in these difficult times, we'll be working with you to find and share solutions. We look forward to celebrating with you this May as the first local television station on the Central Coast.
We'll see you tonight at 4, 5, and 6, but until then, back to the program.
All right, thank you, KSBY. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Thornberg and Dr. Osman up to the stage for your questions. And as they make their way up there, I'm going to start with one of my own, because I think it's important, and there were, in fact, a couple of questions submitted by audience members along these lines. But why is it important that employment in San Luis Obispo grow? We talked about the potential problems of housing prices, quashing employment. Why do we want growth? Some people would say that's perfectly fine. Actually, we'd like to have less people in flow. But why is that a bad thing?
Well, to be clear, it's not a bad thing. It's a choice. So that's I've heard this before, by the way. I remember someone came up to me and, I was talking about he'd build more housing. He goes, I don't want more housing. I don't care about these people. Let them go away. Let them move to Texas. I want my neighborhood quiet. And the thing is listen, this is a democracy. We all vote. And if that's the predominant view, fine. Here's where I have a problem. The problem I have is a person who says, oh, I don't think they should build that apartment building. Why can't my kids live here? Oh, I don't want that new subdivision to go in. Oh, well, what do you mean my favorite restaurant's closing because they don't have enough workers? It's this idea that somehow or other we can have our cake and eat it too. If you're not going to build housing, housing is going to become incredibly expensive, and therefore a certain segment of the population is simply going to have to leave. If you're comfortable with the, shall we say, result of your choice, fine. But it's this hypocrisy that makes me more upset than anything else.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, what can we do to boost multifamily housing in SLO County?
Well, I think, is this thing on? Ultimately, I think just everything comes back to zoning and permitting, right? That's, I think when it comes to the supply side of the economy, developers want to build, right? That's what they exist to do. And if they're not building, that's typically because they're not allowed to build. And so I think ultimately that takes zoning reform. If we want multifamily housing, that typically comes from the government side.
Okay.
And by the way, if you want to see how this could work, a few years ago, of course, there was a tragic fire in Santa Rosa. And the city of Santa Rosa and Sonoma County actually did a really interesting city plan. I think and what was interesting is, again, going back to politics, after the fire, if you will, the NIMBYs sort of had to sit in their hands. And the city was allowed to actually do a significant plan doing what Tanner was talking about. Changing zoning, changing permitting fees, creating incentives for tall, dense structures. Yes. And it's working. It's working. You look at that plan, you put that into play in a place like San Luis Obispo, and honestly, the change could be so dramatic. Particularly here with the university.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, well, since you brought up the P word, how do you see next week's midterms changing economic policy, if at all? Maybe we hear a little bit about the local level or the national level.
At the national level, look, the Republicans will probably take Congress. I don't think they'll take the Senate. If they take either house, it's basically locked down for the next 2 years. Nothing's going to happen, except for the bare minimum, which they're kind of forced to do. Honestly, maybe not a bad thing.
We should red card, green card that.
Exactly. Yeah. If you think that's a bad thing, hold red. If you think it's a good thing, hold up a green. There we go. All right. Tanner, how about locally?
I mean, I think locally we're not expecting too much at the state level, too much change to exist there. I think coming back to Chris's presentation, I think the biggest factor that's going to sort of stymie government policy over the next couple of years is going to be the budget situation. So, with the best will in the world or whatever agenda any politician is going to run on, I think they're going to find themselves, particularly in the state of California, in an environment where they're not going to be able to enact much of what they've been promising.
Yeah, it was a lot more fun to be in the State Assembly last year than it will be next year.
All right. This one's for Chris. And I don't know, is it fair to call your analysis of the economy somewhat sanguine? This person didn't use that word, but...
I was going to say, can you define the word sanguine for me? Is that kind of like a penguin?
I hang out with Bob Wacker a lot, all right? The guy has big words. But
yeah.
What would you say, I guess this particular Q&A person thinks that maybe your analysis perhaps didn't address the poorest people in this country and the challenges that they're going to be facing by higher interest rates as credit card goes up and inflation hits them at the gas pump on their hour commute. And And so speak to that. Speak to kind of the lower
You know,
end of the economy.
it's a great question. And remember, as an economist, I have to talk about the median, talk about the average, talk about the aggregate situation. Look, there is always poor among us. There are always families that need help. And we should. Just basic common decency says we should help families that need help. I never said anything in this conversation that suggested otherwise. But my point is, for example, right now Gavin Newsom is handing out gas checks. Well, maybe that would be helpful if they were limited to truly poor households. If you make less than $400,000 a year and you have 2 kids, you will get $700 from the state. What the hell is that? Right? You have to use the right tool for the right job. Okay, gasoline prices are high for low-income families. You don't deal with that by subsidizing gasoline. We have global warming problems. We should be consuming less gasoline. We should be raising taxes on gasoline to make it more expensive. Now, if you're worried about low-income households, let's deal with low-income households for systems that help low-income households, with earned income tax credits, with pre-K education, with the tools that help the households that need the help. You know, you can't, we use these macro policies to deal with tiny subsets of policies, problems, and that's incorrect. It's not how you do it. Use the right tool for the right job.
I like it. All right, Tanner, this next one's for you. You mentioned zoning. That's a big lever. But we can't help but hear frequently just the cost of building in SLO is so outrageous between labor and materials. So do you see anything on the horizon that would help us bring those costs down and create more affordable housing?
Well, I mean, one big legislative change recently was the ban of minimum parking requirements at the statewide level. Minimum parking requirements, a lot of research has shown that they are binding, that the developers are only building as much parking or supplying as much parking as they are because the regulations tell them to do so. So I think that is a change at the state level, which is going to have some impact because a big cost or a big part of the cost of providing housing is building these subterranean structures if you're building multifamily housing. So that is something that is happening at the state level, which I think could have an impact on especially the cost of multifamily housing.
You know, and at the state level as well, I've always said this, that the state needs to stop trying to use a stick when it comes to housing. Like they want to enforce RHNA standards, and I understand, okay, that's their way of dealing with it. But the problem with RHNA standards is you're trying to force everybody to do a little bit, whether they want to do it or not. And that just creates a lot of resistance at the city level, and a lot of cities are pushing back. And ultimately, you're not going to get anywhere by creating this enmity between state regulators and city regulators, as the case may be. You got kids. You're supposed to use this. They say you're never going to beat your kid into being a good human being, right? You're supposed to use positive incentives. I read that somewhere.
That's what it tells.
I'm told.
I think I own that book somewhere.
Well, I know. Every once in a while, I really want to use some negative incentives, but I attempt not to. But the key is this. If the state really wants to get more housing, they should start using positive incentives. For example, how about we allocate sales taxes at the state level on the basis of population as opposed to where the mall is, right? How about that? Or equivalently, what about the idea that the state starts picking up some of the infrastructure costs that they inevitably, as cities inevitably lump on the apartment builders, right?
Yeah, got some fans
exactly.
of that one.
So there has to be a change in approach. But that change in approach means looking at things a little differently and understanding it's evolution, not revolution. Understand it's not an existential crisis, but, if you will, a policy we need to hone a little better. But again, we don't do well with that in this age of hysteria.
Are you optimistic? I mean, there's been some things in Sacramento along those lines. I mean, are you?
There are, and there's some really smart people up there. I don't know if any of you know a guy named Scott Wiener out of San Francisco. I think he's a very bright guy, and I think he's had some very good ideas, and I've watched his ideas constantly get slammed on the rocks of political realities. And what more than anything else, what his efforts show us is just how broken the political system is. because obviously there are subsets of small special interests that really dominate these conversations in Sacramento. Look, even unions and the control that construction unions have on so many of these projects where they can force builders to pay prevailing wages, which again has got to be one of the most ironic terms ever used in the history of mankind. There is nothing prevailing about $140 an hour for a carpenter or an electrician. Enough. You know, it's funny. We keep giving more and more to the people who have it. And then the people who really need it are more and more ignored.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about labor for a second. So you presented some charts that showed this big mismatch of low-skilled labor in San Luis Obispo. We got a number of questions. I don't know how to ask them all, but how does that end? How does that equilibrium get righted? Maybe just forecast for us what you think might.
Well, I think in the short term, how it's being righted is, I go back to this slide with the graveyard shift at Del Taco. It's being righted by employers having to pay a higher and higher wage to entice people to drive from further distances to fill positions. I think in the short term, the immediate effect is absolutely higher wages. In the long term, how does it get righted? Well, I think it comes back to Chris's very first answer about the type of community that not just San Luis Obispo, but many county or coastal counties want to have. That if you do have sort of a stagnant growth environment from a sort of population standpoint, ultimately you're changing the mix of workers in your local economy. We're seeing that actually play out at the state level, which I tried to show before, whereby we're seeing an exodus of lower income workers and people with lower levels of education, and we're seeing a relative growth in people with higher levels of education. So in the sort of short term, we see higher wages, we see a change in the composition of local workforce as lower income workers are forced out. But I think in the long term, the only way to really resolve it comes back to the conversation about multifamily housing and providing housing for workers who are filling jobs in the community.
Okay, good answer. I'm sensing a theme here. All right, we got time for just a few more. This person has kind of a wonky question. So we're going to get a little wonky for those of you who, love economics. At what point, if at all, will the government move to direct yield curve control with specific tightening across the whole curve, as it happened in the 1940s?
Tanner.
Thankfully, Chris is the macro guy.
Oh, shit. Look,
maybe explain what yield curve control is.
I'm not even sure what they're talking about, to be perfectly honest with you. Yield curve control sounds like price fixing to me. They used price controls in the 1940s during World War II. They used it probably for interest rates. They used it for oil and butter and everything else. That was a way of dealing with the economic pressures created by a massive war effort. I don't think we're in that world right now. The yield curve is driven largely, if you will, by the bond markets with, some, if you will, low-level control from the Federal Reserve. From my perspective, the idea that, the Federal Reserve has the ability to hone this thing like a Swiss watch is kind of ridiculous. These people aren't even in the room, right? I mean, you have completely politicized the Federal Reserve Board. The people on that board have been chosen either because they fill a particular demographic role or they tell a particular political narrative. We're talking about the fine-tuning of Fed policy. Can we just get some people who actually understand what Fed policy is on the Federal Reserve Board? That is the critical problem here. So let's not pretend that, these guys are Formula One race car drivers, so we got to figure out the right G curves to get around that curve in the efficient amount of time. These are like kindergartners, and we just want them to poop in the right place.
Oh, I really feel like we should end there, but I'm not gonna. Okay, final word. We got a great question here. I want to pose it to both of you. We'll start with you, Tanner. What is your call to action? Given everything you've looked at, what would you say SLO County should do? What's your call to action for us?
Well, I think I don't want to mention multifamily housing again. I think we've mentioned that enough. But actually, I really found interesting the presentations by the local entrepreneurs, and I do think that over the long run, economic growth is going to be driven by innovation, and you have this great resource here in the community with Cal Poly. I think that some of the innovations are going to be required to solve for some of the agricultural issues that have been mentioned variously. I think provide great opportunities for the region to be a leader. So to sort of harness those local assets, I think could provide great growth for the county over the next decade or so.
Tanner, that was a really hard question to answer.
On the spot.
And you tried. But can I be clear? You don't have a lot to complain about, people. All right? It's one of the nicest places in the world to live. You have a very good economy. You have amazing wine, of which a lot of people are drinking. Again, first appreciate what you have.
Well, now that you've expressed that lovely sentiment, is there something else you'd like to say?
Nope, I'm done.
Final word? Okay.
I gotta go find a place to poop.
And we did end on poop. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Tanner Osman and Dr. Chris Thornberg. Well, oh, yes.
Can you, if those of you want our presentation, we have a new QR code here. You can come up and take a picture of this afterwards to be able to download it. A little simpler mechanism. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Yep.
Let's hear it for QR codes. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for staying until the end. Hopefully you find your exit nice and smooth with that extra extended light. It's been my pleasure to be with you today. Have a wonderful Friday.